podcast with former GHF board member Ron Kosmal, alias Ray Kessler, and a wonderful panel of contributors. My name is Katja Sipple, the Executive Director of the German American Heritage Foundation and Museum in Washington, D.C., and I will be moderating today's podcast about German Jewish war veterans and how the tragic destinies of real-life soldiers and officers have influenced Ray's novel, A Face in the Night. We will also hear about a new documentary called Stabbed in the Back, a remarkable film that presents for the first time the story of the more than 500,000 Jewish soldiers who served in the Central Powers armies, that is Germany and Austria-Hungary, during the Great War, World War I, from 1914 to 1918, only to then be persecuted a mere 2 decades later during the Holocaust. And this is a topic that has often been overlooked by the public and by historians alike. And one of our panelists, Mike Rugel, who was interviewed for the film, will tell us a bit more about that in just a short while. It is now my great pleasure and my honor to introduce our participants. And Ron, I'm going to start with you as you are the protagonist and the star of the show. So we have Ron Kosmal, alias Ray Kessler, a corporate professional who lives in the greater Washington, D.C. area, majored in international relations and history. And of course, that history background comes in very handy because your novel is a historic novel. A dual citizen of Germany and the US, Ron has lived in both countries and traveled extensively in Europe. A Face in the Night is his debut novel, and it is set in Berlin in 2000 and during the Battle of Berlin in 1945. So 2 parallel story tracks that merge. The main protagonist of the novel is Berlin District Attorney Kurt Becker, and he sees a surreal face whose appearance sends him into a journey of, a journey of discovery and some personal soul searching. And then we have John Friedman. John is a sustainability professional with more than 30 years of experience and the managing director at Grant Thornton LLP. He is a first-generation American, as his father, Walter, was born in London of German parents in the 1930s. And you lived in Germany, John, from 1975 to 1976, when your father's work took the family over there for the second time. He had previously been stationed there. And you call this the most defining year of your childhood. Your grandfather, Hans, born in 1894, was the son of the head cantor of the new synagogue in Berlin, and he was drafted and fought for Emperor Wilhelm in World War I. He was wounded in the Battle of the Meuse, and took 3 days for his countrymen to find him, to rescue him, to take him to hospital. He had bullets removed from his left leg and his arm, and a bullet in his head that remained and stayed with him for the rest of his life. It was inoperable, and removing it, I guess, would have been too much of a challenge at the time. For his service, he received the Iron Cross in 1918, and despite this distinguished service, he was arrested on August the 6th, 1936, and sentenced to 2 years of hard labor for treason. And he eventually fled to the UK upon his release in 1938, and then eventually to the US. And the German citizenship of the family was revoked, as was often the case. And you, John, managed to regain your German citizenship in 2016. I think Oliver has a very similar story there. And he's actually going to be the next person I'm so happy and pleased to introduce. Oliver Moss is an international banking and business executive and currently serves as the Executive Vice President responsible for marketing, business development, and financial operations at the Potomac Exchange, a membership organization that connects newly arrived ambassadors with leading US and international companies to foster greater cooperation in business, investment, trade, defense, and foreign relations, such important topics in this globalized world where yet we see parties splitting up and groups not talking to each other. So thank you so much for doing that. He is also a dual German-American citizen, and he is descended from a prominent German Jewish family. His father and his grandparents managed to leave Nazi Germany following the horrible events of the Reichskristallnacht, the Night of the Broken Glass in 1938. And your grandfather, Siegfried Oliver, fought for the German Empire in World War I. And I remember that you had once showed me a picture. Unfortunately, I'm not able to blend that in today or to share my screen there, but maybe we can put a link to it in the notes for the recording. And your father, Werner, later joined the US Army. So we have a military career track here, military record, both on your father's side and your grandfather's side, but for two different countries. And last but not least, we have Mike Rugel, and he's the Director of Programs and Content at the National Museum of American Jewish Military History. He has frequently written about Jews in the American military and regularly speaks about the history of Jews in the American military at museum programs, at Pentagon, the Walter Reed Army Medical Research Center, as well as to local schools, synagogues, community centers, and veterans group. And you have also produced a series of videos featuring American Jewish liberators of concentration camps, describing these experiences during or at the end of World War II. And I'm so happy to have you all here. And Mike, I'm actually going to start with you because you played an important role in the recently released documentary, Stabbed in the Back. Can you tell us a little bit more about that, please?
Sure. We had the pleasure to screen the Stabbed in the Back documentary at the museum last month. The film was made by a pair of Hungarian filmmakers, Peter Rosenbluth and Peter Banyavari, and it addresses the 100,000 German Jews who served in World War I and the 100,000 more Jews who served with Austria-Hungary during the war. The title of the film, Stabbed in the Back, takes the concept, the German concept where they lay the blame for losing World War I on they say we didn't lose in the battlefield, but we were stabbed in the back by the communists or by the Jews, whoever they choose to be the scapegoat for the losing effort in the war. And the filmmakers flipped that concept and said who was truly stabbed in the back were these German Jews who had devoted themselves to their country, who had served in the military honorably, many of whom were decorated, Iron Crosses, brave service. And then once the Nazi regime takes over, that all goes out the window eventually. There's actually some very interesting progression there where veterans are initially given some privilege that Jews don't have when the Nuremberg laws begin to be implemented by the Nazis. Once Kristallnacht arrives, clear that that's over. But then even after Kristallnacht, at the Wannsee conference, when the Nazis finally established the final solution, it called for the extermination of the Jewish people, there is an exemption there for veterans, saying that they're going to send them to the camp at Theresienstadt, which is rather than one of the death camps, rather than one of the slave labor camps where they are brutal. But all that proves to be temporary, and for those who don't manage to escape the country that are sent to Theresienstadt, it proves to just be a way station on the way to Auschwitz, and then eventually there is no privilege for the German Jewish veterans. They are just Jews, and all they did to prove their Germanness, all they did to serve their country, goes out the window.
So let me actually ask you something. Oh no, sorry, go ahead.
Yeah, no, I was just going to cite a couple of the examples from the film and other things we've had programs on in the museum. Otto Frank's probably the best known example of a German Jewish veteran who, of course, leaves for Amsterdam, and eventually his daughter Anne Frank writes her diary. So he becomes the best known example of that. Another one that ties in with the American military is a guy named Richard Stern, and he's a story we've had programs with. His grandnephew, who wrote a book about Richard Stern. He was from Cologne, Germany, serves in World War I, an Iron Cross recipient, very proud of his service. there's a photo of him from 1933 that has begun to get some wide distribution. It's in some museums in Germany, and it shows him, this Jewish merchant, standing on his doorstep with a Nazi guard right next to him with an iron cross pinned to his chest. And Richard Stern, as this Jewish veteran, as this World War I veteran, is clearly the one with the status, he's looking down at this Nazi officer saying, you know, I served in war. You can't intimidate me. And what he's doing, he's actually handing out leaflets, handing out materials, talking about how the boycott of Jewish businesses is misplaced, and showing how these Jews are good Germans. Richard Stern does end up getting arrested. He's apparently released from jail after that incident because a fellow World War I vet was with the police force, and he saw that Richard Stern got released. Stern stays on in Germany until we get the Kristallnacht, and it proves it's impossible to stay. He leaves Germany in 1939, comes to New York, and enlists in the U.S. Army at age 43. And he ends up getting sent back to Europe. He is fighting in Italy, and he's awarded the Silver Star. And he essentially uses his German language skills to round up the Germans that they're fighting, and he convinces them to surrender. And he was awarded the Silver Star. So he's both an Iron Cross recipient for Germany in World War I and a Silver Star recipient for the U.S. Army in World War II. So just one of those amazing stories that's featured in the film as well as in a good book about Stern.
Well, thank you, Mike. You actually answered one of the questions that I had, which was to give us some examples and to perhaps also address how other veterans reacted to the persecution of their fellow German Jewish soldiers and officers. So some actually had the decency to stand up for the people with whom they fought.
Yeah, and actually that's something I wish we knew a little bit more about. Following World War I, there is a German Jewish veterans organization that, you know, certainly consider themselves loyal Germans, and that exists into the 30s, into the Nazi regime. We don't know about much of it, what they might have done in back doorways to protest. Richard Stearns is the most famous example of this open out in the air protesting, and I think that's an area for some research for historians to know that these Jewish veterans were organized, you know, and what they did to protest the Nazi regime is a good question.
Thank you so much, Mike. Ron, I'm going to now draw the connection to your book. We just heard about real life people who fought bravely in World War I and then suffered dire consequences simply for being Jewish. And you have characters in your book, Karl Rosenbaum and Adam Steinberg, and they're based on some real life characters too, who fought in the German Imperial Army, Max von Oppenheim and the air ace and pilot Wilhelm Frankl. Could you talk a little bit more about that, please?
Sure, and I just wanted to precept it by the fact that when we did hold the event at the German American Heritage Foundation together with the Jewish American War Institute, Kaisertreu, Oliver and John's stories really acted as inspiration to me because just as Mike had mentioned, I really wasn't aware very much of this aspect of German Jewish history. It's not often brought out, and it's so important that message get out. So with that inspiration from these two fine gentlemen and their family stories, I embarked on obviously writing A Face in the Night, which is, you know, a 5-year labor of love. Anyone who says that writing a book is quick and easy, I will beg to differ. And certainly in the research that I undertook, most of it online now, thank God, from multiple sources, I was able to find out about a number of World War I German air aces, and in particular, Wilhelm Frankl, who was awarded probably the most coveted award by the Kaiser, the pour le mériter, which is, you know, the highest order that you can get. He was a brave hero. He fought valiantly for his country and the country that he believed in, as the vast majority of Germans of Jewish faith were all very patriotic, loyal Germans, quite, you know, contrary to what the Nazis claimed. And so he, unfortunately, as a brave German patriot, lost his life in 1917. His plane crashed. But before that, he had tested the new Fokker F-7, which was the latest aircraft, and it was a ceremony that took place in front of the Kaiser. And he had been well liked by many of his colleagues. And then the side story to that is that, very regrettably, several of his other colleagues of Jewish faith who were aces were murdered by the Nazis during the Third Reich. And so that was an inspiration for the character Adam Steinberg, who is the great-grandfather in the novel of Carola Steinberg, who is a Israeli German who at some point leaves Israel in the novel for Germany to conduct an investigation. And so I felt it was very pertinent to bring out, first of all, the discourse in her family about you're going to Germany after all that's happened to us, and then secondly, just to bring out that aspect of her great-grandfather. There is a scene in the book where, which I can relate for personal reasons. My father and mother lived in Berlin, and their German neighbor, who was also a World War I veteran, was dragged down the stairs in the middle of the night. They used a battering ram, and they heard the screams and couldn't do anything. And my father, to the day he died, that stayed with him, because so that was part of the inspiration. And then it was another scene was the figure Karl Rosenbaum, who was the grandfather of Cornelia Rosenbaum. In the novel, she is the loyal secretary to the Berlin district attorney, Kurt Becker. And so at one point, as a side story, I brought in her grandfather's story. He had worked in the Kaiser's intelligence service and had worked for Colonel Nikolai. And so that was an important aspect that I also wanted to bring in. And the real life true figure, of course, is Max von Oppenheim. He served in the Kaiser's intelligence service in the Middle East and also behind enemy lines. Max was able to survive the war, thank God, and resumed his life in post-Nazi Germany. But those were both characters that were, you know, inspiration to real-life individuals who were inspiration to my characters.
Well, thank you so much. And you mentioned earlier that John's and Oliver's ancestors, their family members, inspired you to shape these characters and to delve into the research. Was there any other inspiration?
I think the whole question of redemption and resolution to me was just very important because the novel delves into some other aspects of Nazi Germany, including Nazi eugenics, Lebensborn, the Lebensborn camps, and what happened to the children of Lebensborn camps is still an emotional and difficult subject in Germany to this very day. Many of them don't know who their real parents were, and it is difficult for many of them. So I wanted to bring that aspect out, and certainly I wanted to just bring out how important it is to mention that, yeah, there were just in Germany alone, over 100,000 Germans of Jewish faith who fought bravely for their country. And I will add that over 12% of them were awarded medals, either Iron Cross or pour le mériter. So that was a far higher percentage than let's say Gentile Germans. And I think these facts need to come out because it's important to have that perspective in history when the Nazis used the lies that they did to claim that the Jews stabbed us in the back, the communists stabbed us in the back. No, they didn't. They were very loyal, patriotic Germans, and that was, to me, really, really important that be brought out as a side story in my novel.
Well, thank you so much, Ron. And for the benefit of our viewers and listeners, could you just very briefly explain what Lebensborn is? I think all of us here are familiar with it, but if you could just give a quick explanation.
Sure. So the concept of eugenics was actually founded in the United States. Came from a physician in Chicago, and the Nazis, of course, used that. In Nazi Germany with their racial theories and the idea that they were going to create a so-called perfect German race. So they were of the opinion that breeding children from so-called Aryan Germans, I say so-called because all of us come from one source or another if we look back into our DNA history. But they were breeding these children in different camps, and so in the novel, I will simply say that Kurt Becker was told by his adopted parents, Heinrich and Gisela Becker, that they were his adopted parents. And at some point in the novel, they do mention that Gisela found Kurt as a baby in 1945 at a Lebensborn camp. And again, that's another aspect of German history that is not often discussed or brought up, and I felt it was important to bring up in the novel.
Thank you so much, Ron. I would now like to turn the attention to John and to Oliver, whose personal biographies, after all, served as a major source of inspiration for Ron. And John, I'd like to start with you, please. I understand that you previously participated in a session, a presentation at the German American Heritage Museum. The topic was Kaisertreu, German Jewish veterans of World War I, what role they played in the war, and you have a very interesting, fascinating, really personal story. Could you share that with us?
Yeah, you touched on it in the introduction, and I thank you. And I have to thank Ron, because this was a story that we learned only after my grandfather died in our family, and it was one of those stories that he never wanted told, and my grandmother, Lotte, never wanted told. But in the course of researching a family history that my father did, we were able to unearth a great deal of the detail around it, including answering such questions as, how did my grandparents have the prescience and the presence of mind to have my father born in London? They were Germans, they were living in Cologne at the time, but my grandmother went to England to have the baby. And the answer is that she had been arrested once before and released. And then subsequently, my father was about 4 years old when the Gestapo arrested his parents again. His mother served in was held for 6 months as my grandmother. And then my grandfather Hans, as you mentioned, was convicted and sentenced to 2 years of hard labor. The interesting thing is, my father, until the day he died, which was earlier this year, remembered one of his earliest memories was the Gestapo ransacking the house that he was in. And fortunately, he had family friends who were staying with him who took him to go live with an aunt. Otherwise, we don't know what would have happened to my father, as both of his parents were incarcerated in Cologne.
That must have been an incredibly traumatic experience for a young boy, for a young child. I'm not surprised that he remembered that to the very end of his life, because an experience like that stays with you, of course. And your grandfather was, as I briefly mentioned in the introduction, also a decorated World War I hero. and he was drafted, which was the case for many people, and yet he decided to follow through. This was his duty as a German citizen. He owed it to the country, perhaps even to the emperor. Did he ever talk about that? Did you have a chance to meet him, to discuss that with him?
Well, yeah, I had the pleasure of meeting with knowing my grandfather. He died in 1979, completely unrelated to his war injuries. He would always refer to having been shot in the head, Kopfschuss, whenever he couldn't remember a name or a detail in something, which was absolutely his way of avoiding, having an excuse. There was nothing ever wrong with his memory, but he never talked about his experiences during either World War I or World War II. He, like many of that generation, didn't talk about it. And as I said, he wanted it to remain a secret. The fact that he was convicted of treason by the legally elected government in his country was not something he wanted to advertise as he was applying for American citizenship.
Mm-hmm. And you described in your biography that you sent to us, or that you sent to me, that your grandparents, and by extension your father, had their German citizenship revoked. Now, both Germany and Austria have eased the legislative hurdles for the victims of Nazi persecution to regain German citizenship, but not everybody has taken advantage of that. Now, you said your father died earlier this year. My condolences. How did your father feel about you becoming a German citizen again? That's something I'm very curious about.
My father at that time was in assisted living. He had Alzheimer's prior to passing, but the concept that we had our German citizenship restored to us, and that his children and Hans's grandchildren were German again, was a source of tremendous, I wouldn't even say pride. A lot of Germans don't talk about pride in Germany. They're happy they're German citizens. The word pride is not something that they embrace usually. Again, part of the legacy of World War II and the idea of the guilt that associated with it. But he always said every 20 years he was in Germany. He was raised there. He went and served in the U.S. Army there in the late 1950s. He was there in the 70s for work. We sent him there in the 90s, just keeping the pattern up. And in 2016, the pattern continued one more time as two of his three sons chose to go through the paperwork and have our German citizenship restored. And I should say our children, my son, my father's grandson, is German as well, and as American. And it is, to me, the ultimate recognition of an injustice. You apologize, you make a redress. My grandparents received reparations, and then you undo what you can. I mean, you obviously can't bring back those lost in the Holocaust, but to sit there and say your citizenship was revoked illegally by the government, here, have it back.
That's wonderful, and I'm so glad you feel this way. You have this very positive attitude. And Oliver, your family went through something very similar. You have a similar personal background. Would you mind sharing a little bit about what your family went through, please?
Absolutely, and thank you, Katja, and thank you, Ron. And very much the background is similar to John's, a little bit. And unfortunately, I did not know my grandfather for very long. He passed away when I was 5 years old, so I didn't have much of a conversation with him. And sadly, his wife had predeceased him back in 1947. But in preparing for the last meeting that we had regarding Kaisertreue that you kindly held at the German American Heritage Museum, I was able to gather some information myself, which I didn't know, including the photo that I have with him in uniform. He served, in a relatively minor capacity on the ground for the predecessor to the Luftwaffe. Didn't see much action in World War I, but was very proud of his service. He was a businessman. He and his brother Alex established a textile firm that was in the area in Berlin that was very common. Basically, it was confectionery, not in the German word, the German sense. And both of them had a thriving business. my father, who would recount stories of them, very prosperous, very upstanding, very proud of being German. And in the case of my grandfather, very proud of being Prussian, even so, going back to the Kaiser. And so, again, there was this great shock that took place over time of what was taking place in a previous presentation here for you, Katja. I kind of read some stories out of my aunt's diary. She was the older sister of my father. They escaped and they wound up studying in Italy. But in my grandfather's case, he was actually on a business trip when Kristallnacht took place, November 9th, in Amsterdam, as a matter of fact, and was there. And then his wife had the presence of mind. I don't know how she did this, but she asked her or their Gentile, their Aryan, so to speak, secretary to take the train to Amsterdam and basically tell him, don't come back, stay there. And so she wound up having to settle the affairs of the business, which she had not had any training on. She was not involved in the business, and she and her brother-in-law basically sold the business, had to sell the business under duress, and then wound up getting to England as well, very much like John's family. They were there during the Blitz. Were then sponsored to come to the United States by their oldest daughter, and then finally my father got out. He was able to make it. He studied in the same field, was flown, which was unheard of at that time. You didn't fly, you took trains or buses, but because of the circumstances at the time between the border between Germany and Switzerland, he took a plane from Berlin to Geneva and wound up studying a year at a textile school in Switzerland. And I have in my father's passport, I have a letter from the German congregation, the Jewish congregation, introducing him to the congregation in Geneva. He wound up getting out in 1940 on the Vulcania. And then one thing that I'm very grateful to you is the finding out more about the Ritchie boys, which my dad was, and I believe Richard Stern was as well. And basically what my dad did, and I know more about him, although he also was reluctant because he was an intelligence. He didn't share much information. They didn't do that. And sadly, he passed away before I really had a lot of information. I've gleaned some now, but he basically served in the Battle of the Bulge and interrogated German prisoners of war, and actually had 2 German generals who surrendered to him in Garmisch in the very final days of the war. So that's a little bit of the story. I don't really have much more in terms of my grandfather, Siegfried Moses, except to say that he wound up actually visiting my other grandparents. My mother was Lutheran and lived in Germany during World War II in Stuttgart, and the 2 grandparents actually met. I have a kind of an odd, you talk about reconciliation, John, and I have an odd situation in that, one grandfather, both of them served for Germany in World War II. However, my Christian grandfather was actually a member of the National Socialist Party, and which is ironic because his son-in-law was Jewish. Again, there are very unusual circumstances. I talk with my grandfather, my Christian grandfather, a lot. He was not anti-Semitic. I think that would have been a very difficult thing for him to accept, that his only daughter was marrying a Jewish man. But and for the same reason for my father, they loved each other. And then ultimately, there's no word in English for his Gegenschwieger, his contra-in-law, my father, basically came and stayed with them for a month. And when in 1955 to settle, when he went back to look at reparations, and stayed with them for a month, and then went back to Germany to visit them a second time in 1959 when I was 2 years old, and I have pictures of them, and I have letter correspondence, my dear Willy, my dear Siegfried. So there was a great affection that these 2 men had. They were both in the textile business, and I think they kind of had that reconciliation, and I assume they had some kind of conversation about why they made those decisions, especially my Christian grandfather, why he made decisions at the time. But at the very end, my Christian grandfather was a confirmed pacifist, was very happy that I was American. And so there you have it.
Such a touching story. Thank you so much, Oliver. And I do remember you sharing that with me before. And let me just ask you one more question. You also were able to get your German citizenship restored, correct?
Correct.
What what kind of an experience was that for you personally? Did you feel similar to the way John felt about it, that it was the righting of a wrong, of an illegal act?
I did, and actually, I have to give credit for actually going through this to some friends of ours who worked at the Israeli embassy here, which is kind of unusual. We went and visited them. They had then, after their posting here in Washington, they went to Berlin, and we visited them, and I talked with Shelley and Rahman, and she said that her grandmother had gotten her German citizenship restored, and she did as well. And she said, "Well, why don't you do that?" She actually studied in Germany when at the time that they were posted there with the Israeli embassy, and so I went through the process, and it was very moving. I will say the German embassy, at least for my ceremony, I assume for you too, John, they really take this very, very seriously. I was one of the few people there who actually spoke German, at least at my ceremony. But it was a very moving ceremony in terms of trying to address a wrong and injustice that took place. Sadly, my parents were both deceased at the time, but my children were there, my wife, and just as in John's case, my children and now my grandchildren are also German citizens and dual nationals, and several other family members have decided to do the same thing. And there are other countries that are doing something similar. I think the Hungarians are as well, and I think even the Austrians. So I think this is a concept that is gaining traction, and I think it's appropriate. And I'm very happy to be to have that citizenship.
Absolutely. Yes, and I'm glad to hear that other countries are picking up on those ideas as well. I did know about the Austrians, but it's good to know that the Hungarians are also participating. We just heard two stories, and in some way the redemption was built into those stories. Ron, that takes me back to your novel and the concept of redemption, the focus on redemption. You already talked a little bit about the character of Carola Steinberg, but can you expand a little bit on the importance of redemption, which, also means righting wrongs, but seeking forgiveness as well?
Yeah, no. So Carola Steinberg, of course, as the novel progresses, there's a scene in Tel Aviv where she's with her father, and he's discussing. So just as a point of interest, she is a trained psychiatrist and medical doctor, as well as a investigator. So she in Israel studied Kabbalah, which is a very interesting mystical form of a Jewish faith, and so based on that and the connection between her and Cornelia Rosenbaum, Kurt Becker's secretary, as the novel progresses, things go awry for Kurt Becker, the district attorney of Berlin. He's encircled with all sorts of enemies, and then the whole question of what's taking place around him in terms of what's real and what's not. The medical professionals are at loss, and so Kurt's secretary, Cornelia, decides, I'm going to place a call to Israel. And so she gives Carola Steinberg a call. And against the wishes of her family in Tel Aviv, Carola decides to go to Germany and to, first of all, assist Kurt's physician, Dr. Butcher, in Berlin with the further medical review. She had a license to practice in Germany as well. And so the investigation took place, and they determined that from a medical perspective, there was nothing they could determine that was wrong with Kurt. And so this investigation then takes a turn, and Carola decides to pursue an investigation of what was taking place around Kurt and the English ambassador's wife, Anne Macmillan. And so, of course, this investigation does use some aspects of mystical or mysticism, mystical faith, the Kabbalah. There is also a chapter in the book where Carola and Bruno from Malen from the Psi Institute have a long conversation with the Rabbi Kushner of the Oranienburger Straße synagogue. And so the whole question of Kurt's past and actually the past of certain Germans. There is a character in the novel who was an SS officer, is viewed, is taken a look at, is discussed in the novel. The question of is there redemption for everyone, even if you've been a terrible human being? And so, of course, in the novel, the question of Kaf HaKela, which is similar to the Catholic concept of purgatory, or bardo, as the Buddhists or Tibetans would call it, is brought up in a discussion with a rabbi. And the rabbi determines that that if a soul is wandering endlessly, as is the concept in Kabbalah, and in the book, of course, the soul of this SS officer is wandering endlessly, is there a possibility for redemption? And I will finally say that just based on some investigations related to near-death experiences, there's an Harvard neurophysician Eben Alexander who writes about this concept in his most recent book and how souls travel through planes. So the question of what sort of redemption takes place at the end of the novel is, I think, an interesting one. And for me, it was important to bring an Israeli German in the name of Carola Steinberg and the whole concept of the Kabbalah into play at the end of the novel as we explore the question of resolution and redemption for, first of all, Kurt Becker's past family and this SS officer.
Well, thank you so much, Ron, for that foray into your novel. And of course, the novel can be purchased through Amazon.com, right? We're going to blend in the link in the video description. And it's also already garnered quite a few reviews. Would you like to address that briefly?
Yes, thank you very much. And and also I just want to say at this point a special thanks, first of all, to the German American Heritage Foundation, the German American Heritage Museum, the National Jewish American Military Institute, and also to John and Oliver for participating in this great podcast. Yes, the novel's close to 50 reviews, and very pleased to say John has provided a great review. I also have several other Jewish American friends who have provided reviews, and they've been very positive. Of course, there's always going to be a few people who don't like it, but ultimately, it's the book is selling very well. The novel, the concept of the novel, is doing very well, and that is a great sense of satisfaction to me because I believe it's an important message to continue to discuss in this current day and time.
Well, thank you so much, Ron. I wanted to quickly give Mike another chance to say something. So we are going to, of course, share the recording, and I was wondering if you'd like to say some concluding words from your perspective.
Yeah, thanks for having me on. I think these are really important stories, really instructive stories of what happened to these German Jewish World War I veterans. So it's really a pleasure to be a part of the podcast, and thanks for having me. If anyone wants to visit the National Museum of American Jewish Military History, we're in Washington, D.C., 1811 R Street Northwest, or you can check out the website at nmajmh.org.
Thank you so much, Mike. And of course, the same is true for us. We're located on 719 6th Street Northwest, also in Washington, D.C. And our website is gahmusa.org. and we look forward to welcoming people. We do have some very interesting artifacts, not so much about the German Jewish history, but that's something that can hopefully be rectified, and it's an area that is definitely worth studying. So thank you so much, gentlemen. This concludes today's podcast. It was a pleasure having you all. Thank you so much for the wonderful insights you provided, and thank you, Ron, for discussing these very important topics in your book.
Thank you very much. It was a great pleasure and also a great honor to be here today, and faceinthenight.com, and I look forward to future discussions about this important subject, and best wishes to everyone today. And the recording is stopped.
All right.
Great.
Thanks, everybody. Nice meeting you guys.
Well, thank you. I think we